to hear the whole thing in one sitting, not broken up chunk by chunk. But not only that, he recited it, so you got to hear it spoken rather than just read. And that really brings out some nuances that maybe often get missed when you don't hear it that way. So if you weren't here last week, I'd encourage you to go online or to our podcast and give that a listen, because it was a great start to James and kind of provided some background and some context for the letter as well. Now what we're going to do is over the next 8 weeks, headed towards Easter, we're going to go through this verse by verse pretty much like we do. But James, if you can do a little quick math, James is 5 chapters long. We have 8 weeks to cover those 5 chapters. So as you can imagine, we're going to be taking a few big chunks, this Sunday being one of them. Thank you, Johnny. I'll tell you what, before we read, I want to tell you about some friends of my wife and me. How do you say that? Friends of my wife and I? Friends of mine and my wife's? Take your pick. Eric and Sarah Wardell. I've got some pictures of them and their kids I'm going to put up here. That's Eric and Sarah at the top and their kids. Evan is the tall one, and they've got 2 twins, Ella and Daniel. And Eric and Sarah were friends of ours at the church that we were at before this, and just great people, some of the most sincere and dear people we've met in our lives. Sarah was a good friend to Lisa. Eric was a good friend to me. He was also an elder at the church we were at, so he did a lot to support that church's ministry. As well, Eric and I worked together in a construction company for a short period of time. And Eric was an incredible home builder. And when I say a home builder, Eric literally would take trees and turn them into homes. He had a sawmill, and so he would get loads of logs. He would cut the logs at his sawmill, and he would build log homes for people. He was incredibly talented. He was also capable of doing modern construction as well, so he had a few neat homes on his portfolio also. But he was a fun guy to work with, great heart, man who had a ton of faith in his life and seemed to walk by God's ways the best he could each day. Same thing with the whole family. But Eric and I worked together in about 2007. If any of you jog your mind on history really quick, 2007 leading into 2008 was a pretty tough time to be building homes. And pretty soon the work dried up for the company that Eric and I were both working for, and then for his own sawmill and kind of his own company that he still had on the side. And Eric had no work at all. There's nothing coming in. Eric and Sarah had built their own home up in a neighborhood that was near a school they liked, and Evan was in the elementary school where he had friends, and Ella and Daniel were not far from going to that school. Their home got foreclosed on, so the home they built for their family to grow up in, they lost the home. He didn't have any work, and they basically just didn't know what to do. And I assure you, their faith being as big a part of their life as it was, they were praying this whole time, God, bring the work. God, bring a job. God, help us somehow figure this out. And the answer to that prayer didn't come. Or at least not in the way they thought it would. Now there's more to their story, but I'm going to stop there. And I'm not stopping there for the purpose of leaving a big dark cloud hanging over our entire morning. I think when we read our passage, you'll see exactly why I tell you their story the way that I do. So if you have your fingers there in James, or if you want to follow on the screen, read with me James 2 through 18. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work in you so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, because the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wildflower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant, its blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away, even while they go about their business. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial. Having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised those who love him. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is coming down from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of his truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. Not much there, right? Not only did Johnny allow me to have this passage, he shared with me a commentary that he's been reading for this passage as well, and I thought there was a perfect quote to describe what we're getting into that I'd like to share with you too. This guy, Douglas Moo, said this about this passage. He said, "Finding structure in the letter of James is not easy. He obviously has many different issues and that he wants to raise with his former parishioners and moves rather quickly from one to the other. What relationship, if any, these topics bear to one another is not clear. And nowhere in the letter is this question of structure more difficult than in chapter 1. So that's what we got today. However, well, let me say this, not however. So because of that, it is not my intention over the next 30 minutes or 35 minutes or so that we have to be in the scriptures together to try to impose some kind of structure on this or to try to treat it exhaustively and to study every little nuance of this, because it's just no way to do that. Not only that, we're not entirely sure if James meant these things to be connected as one thought, or if more so he's just introducing his letter. Because here's something that we are going to get. Pretty much everything he covers today in these verses comes up again later in the letter. And so in some ways this may just be his introduction, kind of covering introducing what he plans to cover. So if you feel like we didn't really get into something enough today, keep coming, because we're going to talk about it in more depth over the next few weeks, okay? So what I think might be a good place to start, and this is always a good place to start when you're studying the scriptures, is to try to think a bit about who it was who first received this letter. Who would have been reading it when it was written? Johnny did a little bit of that last week, so I'm not going to repeat what he said. Again, you could listen to that if you wanted to, but I want to kind of look at a bigger context, rather than the specific people it was written to think about the time in which it was written. See, this is first century Roman Empire, very, very close in history to the Greek Empire, too. Like a lot of Greek influence still going on in the Roman world. And when you think about how they thought about gods, how they thought about their faith life, these are the pictures we have of the Greek gods, right? Like the many different gods, the ones whose our planets are named after. I've got a picture up here. I don't know necessarily who these ones are, but you see these statues. Their images were carved in temples and all over the place. And we know some of these stories. If you know a little bit of mythology, you know that these people, these gods, weren't necessarily the greatest character examples that one might follow in their life. These gods were often in bizarre relationships with one another. These gods were often spiteful and vengeful, taking their anger out on each other and taking their anger out on people. People believed that these gods were capable of leading them into battle and either giving them victory or defeat. These gods were powerful enough to bring food or to keep food away, to keep you safe when you're on the sea or to shipwreck your boat. And not only that, but there were gods for all different places. So not only did they believe these gods were powerful enough to do this, they had to keep all these different gods happy based on what it was they wanted and where it was they were at the time. And so this is the world that a lot of the Bible is written into. And that's why we often see, especially in our New Testament, we see these authors continually turning people back first to one God, not many, but to one true God. And not only that, but it's a God who didn't need to be appeased by your sacrifices, by animal and human sacrifice. It's a God that actually wasn't even angry with you anymore. It's a God that was willing to give good gifts. It's a God, as James talks about here, who hears your prayers, who is willing to hear and to answer your prayers. It's a God who offers a rich life, an abundant life, even if you don't live a wealthy life. You don't have to be in good status to receive blessing and favor and love from this God. How much do you think people needed to hear that in this time in the world? Desperately, I think. Maybe some of us still do need to hear some of those things, that God hears us, that God's not angry with us, that God doesn't need us to get things just right in just a certain way in order to be nice to us that day, and if we mess it up, no longer is he going to be nice. I think the message carries forward a bit. So that's some of what James was writing into whenever he wrote his letter. Additionally, too, what we can see from the letter itself is we know that the people who were reading this were facing some kind of struggle. He doesn't try to list them all, so I think there's a sense in which this covers trials and struggles generally. But some of the ones he does list point us to the fact that we know these people were struggling, some of them were struggling with poverty, with deep oppressive poverty, possibly at the hands of the wealthy. because he talks later about people not being paid what they were due. So it's possible that that was one of the struggles he was writing into. He tells us in this passage we read now that his people need wisdom, so that seems like one of them. Potentially persecution, because we know that went on in the early century. Temptation in their lives, struggling with unbelief, and maybe even with just weariness from carrying on. Can you relate to some of those too? Yeah, a lot of these themes, though they were written into a culture that may be pretty different from ours, a lot of our struggles are still the same. And so we are his audience just as much as they are. But I think when we keep some of those things in mind, we can see that he's likely touching on those verse after verse after verse. And throughout his letters, working to change some of what we think of about God. Now let's look at the text for a minute. I'm going to show you a couple things, and if I move a little fast in this, I hope you'll forgive me on that. But just for the sake of time, I don't want to belabor these points. But the first verse that we read talks about trial. Verse 2, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." Now, I'm not a language expert, so I'm going to get this pronunciation of this word wrong likely, but the word for trials here is this word, perasmos. And some variation of this word or another word comes up a lot in this passage. We see it there in verse 2. We see it again in verse 12 when he says, "Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, having stood the test, that the person will receive the crown of life the Lord has promised to those who love him." So this word comes up here for trial. And this is seen elsewhere in the Bible too. We'll talk about that in just a second. Is this outward trial that we face, things on the outside. But the exact same word, or at least variations of it, are also used for inward things. So here in verses 13 and 14, when we see these words, it's also, when we see the word tempted, I should say, when we see the word tempted, it's also perasmos. "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me.' For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed." That's the same word there. So that's a little bit interesting for one. There's not this sharp distinction between your trials on the outside and your temptations on the inside. For the people who are reading this, that word was the same, and it could carry meaning either direction. And this comes up often in our New Testament. Again, moving really quickly, but Peter writes a lot about suffering and trials. And we see him in 1 Peter 6:7. "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have suffered grief and all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith of great..." Well, I read that wrong, but it's right there. The trials, that's the same word there, that outward oppression. In Acts, some of the things that the apostles faced, that same word, outward oppression. But we also see it with temptation. When Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, that story, if you know that one, that's the same word. That's the same word. And as well, one more verse, 1 Timothy 6-9. Let me read this one for you. "Those who want to get rich fall into perasmos, and a trap, into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction." Though James didn't write that verse, Paul did. I think James would agree very much with Paul's use of this word here. And how interesting that he correlates the desire to be rich, that inward desire and longing for more, with temptation, with a trap, foolishness, with trial. Something James is going to do as we go through this book, if he's not doing it already, he is going to push our understanding of wealth and poverty and how those may not be exactly the rules. They may not work exactly in the rules that we've given them to work in, and the framework in which we build our lives upon things that are rich or things that are poor. He often reverses those things. It's hard when that happens. It's uncomfortable. But man, it's also really good. And we're just opening that up today. James comes back to it, so that's all I'm going to say on that today. Okay, keep those thoughts about trials and temptations on the table here for a second, and I want to look at another verse here. Let's move into verses 5 and 8 where they talk about doubt. In verses 5 through 8, James says something that I read and I thought, what are you talking about? Let's just read it. He says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you." Now that's great. But then he says this, "But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like the wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do." I read this and I was like, really, James? Is that what you're saying? Don't doubt ever. Just don't do it. Because that's really unhelpful. in my opinion. If that's all he's saying is don't doubt ever, well, great. That's not something I can do. Despite my deepest desires, that's not something I can do. And I imagine that's not something that most of you can do. So if that's really all he's saying, I don't think we have much to go on here. But this is not the only place where our New Testament writers talk about doubt. And let me just show you a couple other places where similar language comes up and where we know a bit more of the story. And I think we can really get at what he's getting at here too. In Romans 4, Paul talks about Abraham. And just a real quick background, if you don't know the story of Abraham, God promised him at an old age that his wife would bear a child, and that child would give birth to many people, eventually becoming the nation of Israel. Now, because they were both old, Abraham's response to that was what? He laughed. Hey, thanks, I got a ha. Way to go. Yeah, he laughed. He laughed at what God promised he would do. And then not only that, after God didn't do it for a number of years, Abraham decided to come up with his own plan and had a child with one of Sarah's maids. They thought, well, this is surely the way to do it. God's not coming through with it. I'm going to take this on and figure out how to do it. And God wasn't very happy with that. And eventually, Sarah did conceive and bear a child, and what God had promised came to fruition. But does that sound like doubt a little bit? Listen to what Paul says about Abraham in Romans 4. Yet he, Abraham, did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had the power to do what he had promised. This is why it was credited to him as righteousness. I assure you that the people reading Paul's letter there knew Abraham's story. He wasn't like tricking him thinking, oh, they'll never find out the truth about this. They knew the story. But yet Paul says that Abraham lived a life of unwavering faith. Jesus says something similarly in Matthew 21. He had just done this miracle where he withered a fig tree just by stretching out his hand. And he said this to his disciples, Matthew 21. He says, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what was done to the fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, 'Go, throw yourself into the sea,' and it will be done. If you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer." How many of you ever heard a story of somebody praying a mountain into the ocean? I don't know of any. I've never heard of that happening. How many of you even know anyone who receives whatever they ask for in prayer? If there is someone who that's true of, I guarantee you it's because the only things they pray for are things that they know God will answer. It's this very humble prayer that just kind of leaves room for God to do his work. It's not asking for whatever they think is best. So if Jesus is saying that if you only had enough faith, you could do these things. If Paul was saying Abraham was unwavering in his faith, but yet we know that doubt persists nonetheless, I think we can say, not trying to just, gloss over the stuff or just let it wash off our back or something like that, we can say the point here is not just don't doubt, but rather they are trying to point us toward fully believing that God is capable of doing the things he says he's going to do. Some of the things James, the language he uses here, the giver of good gifts, the one who brings new birth to us, the one who can lead us into richness regardless of our circumstances, the one who can take our trials and turn them into something beautiful and good. This is what I believe he is moving us toward. My friends, the Wardells that I was telling you about earlier. The Wardells, as I mentioned, they were faithful people. They were devout people in many ways. And I assure you that when God was not answering their prayers to have their bills paid, to be able to keep their house, to have work come in, they doubted. There's no way they couldn't have. But yet they also kept their hearts and minds set on God. And it was encouraging to watch them do that, to watch them begin to lose everything in their life, but trust that God was at work for something greater. Eugene Peterson has a name for this. He has a book. It's called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. And I think that really captures what James is encouraging us towards. Not that we can't have moments where we question, not that we can't have moments of uncertainty, but that despite those moments, we still trust. We persevere into a long obedience in the same direction, which is precisely what Abraham did. It's what Jesus Christ did in his life, too. Following God through suffering, even through doubt and questioning in the Garden of Gethsemane, but trusting that God was up to something despite how difficult the circumstances became. In fact, I would go as far to say that maybe James understands that we need those trials to actually form this kind of faith in us, to actually get us past our doubting, past our worries, past our fears. Sometimes we actually have to go through that tough stuff in order to let go of those things. James writes in this passage and later on in his book about double-mindedness. It's a call for us to become whole. Because I think what he's getting at in this double-mindedness is this sense that yes, we trust God, or yes, we want God's Spirit to work in our lives, to bring us healing, to move us forward, to answer prayers. And then yet very often we couple that with our own ideas or plans or desires, right? And James is trying to say, let go of that and set your eyes singularly upon God. Let your minds, your bodies, your spirit, all of these things be integrated into a whole life. Long obedience in the same direction. Jesus had a way of saying this too, didn't he? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. Now, as I talk about this double-mindedness, I'd be a fool if I just got up here and thought, okay, well, there we go, I've explained it, and didn't do a little bit of self-reflection. And as I did, I know I'm fully capable of seeing God start something in my life. Maybe I prayed and felt like he answered the prayer, or there was, a door that opened that seemed like clearly this is something God's guided me to walk through. And those are pretty powerful moments when you feel like God does that. Maybe some of you can relate to what I'm saying. And I'm very good at saying, thanks God, I'll take it from here. And then I'm walking along and I'm figuring stuff out, or I'm just doing things, or I kind of hit the ground running. And then somewhere along the lines, I realized I've stopped praying about this thing. I've stopped seeking God's guidance about this issue in my life. And I'm stressed about it, and I'm not sure what to do next, and I don't know why. It's because I took over. It's double-minded. I try to step in the way of what he was doing. Or there will be this moment of prayer or of worship or of study or something that's really beautiful and powerful. And then next thing I know, whether it's later that day or the next day, there's something in my life that's just ugly and doesn't even fit next to a moment like that. I can tell my wife how much I love her and how much I care about her, and then be incredibly inconsiderate to her moments later. I'm so sorry. I suck. Thanks. I do the same thing to God. I'll sing this, Jesus, we love you. Our affection, our devotion poured out at your feet. And then show the same kind of inconsiderateness to God or to one of his children, somebody that I meet later in the day. Or maybe you've come into my office. You had a struggle going on. You sat down and I gave you just this super encouraging and motivating pastoral spiritual advice about how just be patient. God is at work in your life and good things are going to come from this. And I guarantee you that night I went home and I was all stressed out and bent out of shape about the teeny little things in my life that aren't quite going the way I'd hoped they would. I'm serious about that too. And I get bent out of shape about some of the smallest things while I'm encouraging some of you to take on the world. And it's exhausting. And it's not pretty. And I imagine in one form or another, maybe some of you can relate. James wouldn't have to write about our double-mindedness if we likely didn't see it in ourselves. And when I stand up here and say it, I know that kind of back and forth is not helping anything. What I know is true is that God is calling each of us to let go of that crippling double-mindedness, inwardly and outwardly, and let his Spirit integrate our faith into every niche of our life. And sadly, sometimes it takes hard things to do that. Sometimes it takes trials. Sometimes it takes struggles. Sometimes it takes things that we never would have signed up for. Sometimes it takes something in our life dying. It takes a death in us to give birth to something new. And I love that James writes about that here in this passage in verse 18. It's not going to be up here, but we read it earlier. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth. Certainly recalling the idea of being born again in Christ, who is the word of truth. God gave us birth in the word of truth that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created, the best of what he created. This is what he's leading us towards. New birth, new life in Christ, even if it comes through pain and struggle, that we might be seen as the very best of all he's created. That's what he wants for us. That's what James is encouraging us with and what he's leading us towards. The tricky part is doing it. If you know the New Testament well, if you know the Bible very well, if you've got your memory verses, you probably have a verse about perseverance. You probably have a verse about pressing on. You may know that this is fundamental to the Christian faith. But is it more than a catchphrase? Is it more than knowledge? What makes it more than just a bit of information that we can check on our box if, yes, I understand that? Or maybe you've seen these posters. I got a couple posters for you. These posters on your wall that help you move forward. Grace, if you'll put those up for us. Right? This is good. These can be motivating. Sometimes you need to look at this and just think, I'm going to persist, keep going on. Or, yeah, you could do that one too, if you're more of the kitschy kind of person. Oh, that's right. I know, kittens are cute. And these are helpful, right? These little reminders are helpful. But something has got to take it deeper. And I'm pretty sure that what James is reminding us of here is that it's often our struggles that do that work of planting this into something real in our lives. There's a group of women in our church who's been living with this idea for the past several months. Sarah Soule leads a Bible study of women on Tuesday mornings, and in a study they're currently doing and in a study they did previously, the women have been taking this idea head on and seeing God at work in their struggles. Because it's not just in a few passages here in James, it's actually all over our Bibles. So what I thought might be good is, since they have been spending their time with this, they've been letting this work on them for a while, I wanted Sarah to just come and share with you a bit about what that's been like, what they've talked about, what they've learned. So Sarah, come on up. I'll move this out of your way. Oh, you'll use it. Then I will not move this out of your way. Yeah, just grab your mic.
Well, I'm Sarah, if I haven't met you before, and I have the privilege of leading a small group of women on Tuesday mornings. And last fall, we did a Bible study on perseverance and suffering, and it was based on Romans 5, verses 3 through 5. And after 8 weeks of sort of gutting through a really tough study, what we ended up with was a jar of marbles. It's kind of like my parents went to Hawaii and all I got was this t-shirt. So we have a jar of marbles today. And the question is, what does a marble jar have to do with suffering? And so let me introduce the study that we did. It's called Looking for Lovely by Annie Downs. And it was based, again, on Romans 5, 3 through 5. And I'm going to read that for you. It says, not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. And so we walked through pieces of that verse every week. And the title of the study, Looking for Lovely, was woven throughout the entire book. So let me read just a little bit from the book. This is from the author's point of view. She says, there's a correlation I'm finding between beauty and perseverance, between looking for lovely and not giving up. And beauty is in the eye of the beholder, is it not? It's not just in the things that everyone sees, but it's what you see, what sticks out to you, the unique moments that God gives you to collect and hold and draw strength from during the difficult times. She goes on to say, so what is the role of beauty in perseverance? You may be surprised to know that it's a big one. If we're going to finish the brave, hard, challenging things that God has called us to do, we have to look for the lovely moments. But we also have to decide that persevering is going to be worth it. That's it. That's kind of the thing here. And so that's what this jar, not the marbles, but the jar itself, what it represents is the belief and the trust that what God is calling us to is worth it. She goes on to say, she talks about the underlying faith that has to be in place in order for this to work. That the discipline of looking for lovely is based in peace with God and peace in God. Because without him as our foundation, we can look for all the lovely we want and it will eventually just fade away. She goes on to talk about peace with God, saying, peace with God is a gift given to us when we accept Jesus. And peace in God is a choice we make again and again and again. Something we can choose to grab onto and wrap ourselves in. Peace with God gives us permission to ask and pursue peace in God. And for her and for lots of us, peace feels like stopping and taking a breath. It's listening, it's asking God to calm the waves and give us a sense of his presence. And so that's what we did. This jar, if you're a classroom teacher, it represents behavior management. Okay, if you're quiet, you get a marble. If you can make it through lunchtime without any food flying, you get 2 marbles. It's not behavior management. And it's not just a decoration. It's a trust that persevering matters and that God will be faithful to his promises. And so these marbles represents the moments that we took to stop and find God's peace in the middle of a storm and his provision in the middle of a barren season. So let me give you a few examples. So every Tuesday morning, the women would sit around the table, and no matter where we were in our day or in our lives, thank you, I appreciate it. Thanks, Vanna. Thank you. This is what it would look like. And we made a commitment to show up as is. And so it might be put a marble in the jar because I had a great walk yesterday in beautiful weather. Or maybe I'll put marble in the jar for a good meal eaten with some good friends. Or maybe I put all the marbles in the jar because I had a babysitter for the whole weekend. But you can put it down now. But the marbles represent more than just happy little stories and happy little lives. And they don't represent Band-Aids of positivity just sort of slapped on an open wound. What they represent is the belief that the strength to carry on is best found one obedience at a time, one choice at a time, one belief at a time. And so I've seen this at work, not just in our Bible study, but in this body of believers. I've seen an adoptive mother choosing to immerse herself in scriptures, saying the word, singing the word, hanging it all over her house as she waited to bring her baby girl home. I've seen a woman trudging through the haze of postpartum depression and going out in her garden and finding new life growing there. And that was all she had to hang on to. I've seen people grieving the loss of loved ones. A granddaughter testifying through her tears of loss about the legacy of faith that her grandmother left for her and for her children and for her grandchildren and for her great-grandchildren. And that is how we look for Lovely. I've seen parents lean into their community after a devastating diagnosis and find God's faithfulness in casserole dishes and company at their bedside vigils. And so these marbles represent a lot of what goes on here. The little networks of prayer and intercession that we share with each other that are woven throughout this room. And many of you, I think, could testify to that, to the beauty that's in that, the lovely that is God's provision for us. And that is what gives birth to hope. And all of this is summed up really well by something written by Henry Nouwen in his book, With Open Hands. It says, "Only if you pray with hope can you break through the barriers of death. For no longer do you want to know what it will be like after you die, what heaven will look like exactly, or how you will be eternal. You don't let yourself be distracted by daydreams in which all your conflicting desires are satisfied in a wish come true hereafter. When you pray with hope, you turn yourself toward God, trusting fully that God is faithful and makes all promises real. This hope gives you new freedom that allows you to look realistically at life without feeling dejected. Every prayer of petition becomes a prayer of thanksgiving and praise as well, precisely because it is a prayer of hope. In the hopeful prayer of petition, we thank God for God's promise and we praise God for God's faithfulness." So I want to leave you with reading Romans 5:3-5 one more time. "Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit."
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah. I thought she said, each of those, did I turn myself off? Each of those marbles was not, or just finding the things in their life that were happy or good or joyful. They weren't Band-Aids just trying to mask the pain. But they were moments of belief where God is working and that God is leading you forward. I've asked our musicians to come up and play a song for us. And another thing Sarah said was she said sometimes just that reflection was a bit of stillness in the midst of the storm, a chance to find peace. And in just a few minutes, they're going to sing a song that I hope provides a little bit of that space for you. I know that when we talk about trials and suffering and all that, it brings up far more responses in you than we could possibly hope to cover in a sermon. But I know that God's Spirit works personally and individually. I want to invite you to just take a few minutes to reflect about what it might be like to have our eyes upon Christ, trusting that he understood suffering and went through it to give us closeness with God, to give us an ability to trust God, to hear our prayers and to answer us, an ability to be born